Sounds good. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the ACS for their November Speaker Series program. My name is Jane Vanderhagen, and before I introduce the speaker, I would like to make just a couple announcements. Monica Wayland is the co-founder of the Orca Behavior Institute. She will be speaking about the southern resident orcas at our December 9th program, so it should be very interesting. So mark that down on your calendar. And then in mid-December, it kind of marks the beginning, give or take, a little bit of the gray whale migration season in San Diego. So I encourage you to enjoy this magnificent experience of migration. Check out the list of the whale watching companies on our website and get out on the water and enjoy it. Lots of different ways to watch it, from simple zodiacs to stable and big hornblower and everything in between. So lots of great opportunities. And then speaking about the gray whale season, I received some information on the unusual mortality event that began in 2019. It is continued into the 2020 with additional strandings along the Pacific coasts of Mexico, the USA, and in Canada. And as of October of this year, NOAA reported about 384 gray whale strandings that had been actually investigated. So it's ongoing. Everyone kind of keep your eyes open. If you start seeing some pretty skinny whales, let's kind of make note of it. And hopefully these guys are going to, hopefully this year will be different. They haven't really determined exactly what the underlying cause is, so they're still working on it. I think they have some ideas. Anyways, January 13th coming up is a speaker that we haven't determined yet. So, but mark it on your calendar for the 13th and we'll keep you informed. And then January 30th, the ACS National is going to be putting on a virtual conference. We're just fine tuning right now the last of our speakers. We're kind of trying to coordinate the right time frame. So that information will hopefully be coming out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So, but January 30th, it's a virtual conference. And then as a reminder, our presentations are free to watch, and we really welcome you. If you'd like to become a member, however, we also really encourage that. It helps us, protect whales, dolphins, and porpoises through education. And it's relatively inexpensive. So if you're a student or teacher, it's $35, $45 for a regular individual. All right, so for tonight's speaker, plastic now pollutes all dimensions of our ocean, from the surface to the seafloor. With an estimated 11 million tons of plastic waste flowing into the oceans every year and the demand growing, we need to do something about it. With no single solutions and a situation that is worsening exponentially, we need to do much more, and we need to start now. Tonight's speaker is very serious about removing trash from our oceans, where his field work in ocean plastics and debris has taken him to more than 20 countries across 5 continents. He has engaged in policy discussions and has testified before the US Senate on the sources and impacts of ocean plastics. Please help me welcome Nick Mallos, Senior Director of Trash Free Seas at Ocean Conservancy, presenting No Time to Waste, Ocean Plastics from Source to Solution. There you go, Nick.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. It is a pleasure to speak with all of you. As I noted, I'll share my screen right now. Looks like host has disabled participant screen sharing. So, as I noted, my journey on this issue actually has been about 15 years old, but in 2010, one of the most prominent experiences I had was a 3-week research expedition throughout the North Pacific Gyre across the Pacific Ocean, researching plastics in what is better known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And the end of that cruise actually culminated in San Diego as part of the Tall Ships Festival in 2010, because my research vessel was actually 150-foot tall ship. So I have a lot of connections to San Diego in my pathway to where I am today, and I'm just really, really excited and pleased to be able to share experiences with you. Rick, I'm not sure, it says I am not able to share because host has disabled participant screen sharing. Yep, perfect. There we go. All right, sounds like we've got it. And I will go ahead and share that. Perfect. And there we go. Hopefully, can everyone thumbs up if you can see my screen? Okay. Okay, great. Looks like we can. Wonderful. Well, we'll get right into it. So again, I've had the great opportunity over the last 10+ years at Ocean Conservancy to visit many amazing places around the world to investigate the issue of ocean plastics. And unfortunately, I've been to some of the most beautiful places on this planet, but unfortunately, instead of going there to research whales or other amazing marine species, I'm often there trying to figure out how polluted their beaches are or understand the extent of the plastics issue. So, you know, my hope tonight is just to share with all of you kind of where the science is globally around this issue. What do we actually know about the issue of plastics? Why do we care about plastics in the environment? And just a few thoughts on where and what we need to really get a handle on the issue globally as we move forward as a global society. So I look forward to answering questions at the end, and I'll get right to it. And again, thank you all for having me. But at Ocean Conservancy, we're almost a 50-year-old organization based out of Washington, D.C., with offices around the country. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and our work really stems across, you know, various realms of work to try and ensure resiliency and a healthy ocean for future generations. And when it comes to how we evaluate the future of ocean health, it really comes down to two simple, you know, components. One is that the fact that we are taking too much out of our ocean at present, and secondly, that we are putting too much in. So we're taking, you know, a lot of non-renewable resources out. We're extracting fish in many places around the world at rates that are simply not sustainable with a healthy ocean, and just, you know, a variety of other extractive measures that are very incompatible with a healthy ocean for our future. At the same time, we know we are putting far too much in, and that can be in the form of carbon through climate and greenhouse gas emissions. The ocean is very good at sequestering carbon, which changes the chemistry of the ocean. We know that we are putting a lot of nutrient runoff in from farming and agriculture measures. And then lastly, in the world in which I work in day out, we are putting far too much debris in, and of greatest concern is plastic pollution. And so these things together really make an uncertain future for the health of our ocean. And when it comes to marine debris, I think the one thing, marine debris, plastic pollution, ocean plastics, whatever you want to call it, compared to the rest of the challenges that our ocean face, the silver lining there is that it is the easiest thing to solve. We know that we simply need to stop plastics from entering the ocean to just eliminate this threat. I also think it is safe to say that we now know very well that plastics contaminate all parts of our ocean. And it is almost impossible to turn on your Twitter feed, open up Facebook, read the newspaper every day, and not see some story about the issue of plastics, whether it's with respect to the ocean or just with plastics more broadly in our global society. It truly has permeated every dimension of our social life. And that is also true of our global ocean. We know that plastics, as Jane eloquently said, now really infiltrate every aspect of our global ocean, from the seafloor to the sea surface, from the poles to the equator. And what we know is that in 2015, a seminal publication that was published in the journal Science for the first time gave a global estimate of how many plastics are entering our ocean annually, as well as a rough roadmap of where those inputs are largest at present. And that study, published by Dr. Jenna Jambek et al., showed that roughly 8 million metric tons of plastic enter our ocean annually. This was in 2015. And again, that's roughly at the time was equivalent to 1 garbage truck per minute. And I share this 2015 science because what's most notable about this is that almost overnight following the publication of this, the world truly deemed this unacceptable. Until this point, there was a lot of conversations about floating islands of trash in the ocean, plastic bags need to go. But really, this publication kind of changed the global narrative overnight to one where 8 million metric tons was all of a sudden deemed just simply unacceptable for the health of our ocean moving forward. And so following this science, we saw kind of outcry around the world from individuals, from corporations, from governments, and we saw a range of global commitments that were made aimed at trying to reduce plastic pollution entering our ocean. This again happened at all levels of government, at voluntary commitments put forth by corporations, and many individuals just becoming more aware of their daily lifestyles and their individual footprint they have on the issue. So has it worked? Where are we now? Well, if we fast forward 5 years to now 2020, in September of this year, my colleagues and I published a paper in the journal Science. They kind of took stock of where we are today. And what we now know is that global annual inputs of plastics into aquatic ecosystems, so aquatic, that means lakes, rivers, oceans, all together, is now on the margins of 24 to 35 million metric tons annually. And if we look at just the ocean component of that, in the same journal of Science, colleagues of ours published a separate manuscript that looked at the ocean component, and they estimated that roughly 11 million metric tons is going into the ocean alone. And Jane referenced this figure in her opening remarks. So what we know is that despite the global kind of acknowledgement that plastic pollution is unacceptable, 5 years later, since that first seminal publication, we are seeing a trajectory in growth of plastic pollution in our environment that is not sustainable with a future planetary health for our global population. So how do we actually get a handle on this? Well, we also know in this paper that we published, we didn't just try and quantify how bad is the problem today. We also tried to evaluate, okay, how can we actually make a meaningful difference and get a handle on bending the curve, so to speak, of plastic pollution in the future? And what we did was look at, okay, we know a lot of those commitments that have been made over the last 5 years. If we assume all of those commitments go into effect today and are successful, what effect will that have on plastic pollution in the year 2030? 2030 being the year when many of the global sustainable development goals and other commitments line up. And what we see is that even if we succeed in implementing all of the current commitments currently made by global governments, corporations, multilaterals, and individuals, still by 2030, we're looking at a scenario where we have a cargo ship's worth of plastics by weight entering our aquatic environments every single day. And so what we know is that our current trajectory is not sustainable. So how do we get a handle on this? How do we actually move forward in a way that starts to bend the curve and get us more towards those baseline levels that were announced in 2015? So the final component of the research we published was, okay, how much effort would it take to reduce plastic pollution globally to those 2015 levels? And I want to acknowledge here that our endeavor here was not to get to zero, because unfortunately we're at the point at present where over the next decade, we simply cannot get global plastic pollution to zero. What we can do based on ambitious commitments and kind of moving forward with efforts is to try and get pollution levels below that 2015 level of 8 million metric tons. And so we looked at a comprehensive model globally about what it would take to try and actually stabilize plastic pollution in our global ocean and global aquatic environment. And what we see first is, we looked at this through 3 different levers, and that is 1, reducing plastic waste. So thinking about phasing out problematic products. 2 is better managing waste. And lastly is continuing with cleanup efforts that we know are critically important. And what we see through this analysis is that we need to drastically reduce plastic waste somewhere in the realm of 25 to 40% globally. And this range really looks at different countries based on their economic levels. So in places like the United States, where we are a high income society, we need to reduce plastic waste by upwards of 40% over the next decade. At the same time, in a lot of lower income societies, we need to reduce plastic waste somewhere in the realm of 25 to 30% to really just reduce the amount of unnecessary plastic waste that is being generated. And when we talk about unnecessary plastic waste, we're talking about things like plastic bags, foam takeaway containers, for which we know there are suitable alternatives. At the same time, we can't just reduce waste. We also need to get a better handle on waste, because we know lack of waste management in many parts around the world is one of the main reasons why we are seeing large amounts of plastic flowing into aquatic ecosystems. And so over the same period between now and 2030, we need to significantly increase waste management around the world, somewhere between 60 to 99%. And that range is the same type of correspondence as the waste reduction, 60% being in lower income economies, 99% being in places like the United States, the EU, and elsewhere that are very large consumers of plastics. And then lastly, even if we achieve both of these levers and really get a handle on reducing plastics, managing the remaining fraction, we still know that there's going to be a portion of plastics that find their way out into the environment, on beaches, into waterways, and ultimately in the ocean. And so we still need to target cleanup measures that are tackling up to 40% of annual pollution levels by 2030. So all of this to say is, when we try and think about what will it take by the year 2030 to stabilize the ocean against ocean plastic pollution, we are talking about a Herculean effort. We need to do everything. We need to do it bigger. We need to do it faster, and we need to do it yesterday. And this really has galvanized the global discourse over the last month around the fact that we are currently not on pace. Our ambition is not ambitious enough to truly bend the curve of plastic pollution going into our aquatic ecosystems, particularly the ocean, which we know has detrimental effects. At the same time, my colleagues and I over the last year have been trying to reevaluate, okay, what is the role of the United States in this global equation? So this is the same image I shared with you earlier, which highlights the findings from that 2015 study that showed not only do we know that 8 million metric tons of plastics were entering the ocean annually, we also know that based on just a fundamental mismatch between consumption of plastics and the lack of waste management, we are seeing very large inputs of plastic waste entering the ocean in just a small number of rapidly developing economies at the time located in Southeast Asia. And this is represented by the size of the bubbles you see on the screen. What we see is that the United States, there circled in red, was still part of the equation. We knew US ranked 20th in terms of global countries contributing to ocean plastics. But at the time, it was not deemed to be nearly as such a large contributor as some of these other countries, again, represented by those bubbles. However, we know the 2015 analysis looked largely at population size, looked at the amount of plastic waste that is generated by populations, and the amount of populations living within a relatively close buffer to coastlines. And so what it does not account for the fact is that the United States over the last 3 decades has shipped a lot of its plastic waste overseas to many of these countries that were deemed to be large polluters of the ocean. And so over the last year, several of my colleagues and I, Dr. Carol Lavender Law at the Education Association out of Woods Hole, Dr. Jenna Jambick out of University of Georgia, Ted Siegler and Natalie Starr, who are 2 waste management consultants with over 80 years of experience combined, and then my colleague, Dr. George Leonard at Ocean Conservancy, and I undertook an analysis to reevaluate the potential contribution of the United States if you factor in the complex dynamics of plastic waste exports around the world. And what we see is that it really changes the story. And what we know is that the United States, while only 4% of the world's population, generates nearly 17% of its plastic waste annually. And to put that into perspective, a year's worth of plastic waste that is mismanaged in the United States would really cover the entire White House lawn piled as high as the United States. So we are generating huge amounts of plastic, and much of that is not being managed in a way that is responsible either within our countries or outside our borders. And rather than talk to you, I'm going to take a pause now, and assuming technology cooperates with us, I'm going to actually share a little video that hopefully illustrates this in a way that is far more compelling than I could potentially share. So I'm going to pause this, and again, assuming I can get my meeting controls to work, I am going to share a video here, and hopefully everyone can see this.
We don't have sound though.
Oh, rats. I'm hopeful that the text will actually convey the main point. And again, I'm happy to share the link to this video following this evening's presentation so that if anyone's interested, you can by all means listen to the narration. Apologies.
And Nick, we'll post it with this video. We'll post that so people can access it.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone. Hopefully, there was some information gathered through the text in there. And again, I apologize for the audio. You'd think 9 months in we'd have a handle on the Zoom stuff, and I have yet to figure out how to share audio apparently. But again, that link will be available following tonight, and I do encourage everyone to look at that again. It really does a nice job of summarizing it. But ultimately, the takeaway here is from our research, which was published October 30th in the journal Science Advances, that when you factor in littering, illegal dumping within the United States, and also factor in the large amount of plastic waste that we have been sending overseas for more than 3 decades to places that do not have the ability to properly manage it, all of a sudden the United States becomes as high as number 3 on the list of countries contributing to ocean plastic pollution. So all of that is to say is we have a great opportunity here at home in the United States to significantly reduce our own plastic waste footprint through smart policies, but also by doing so, we will have positive cascading effects to many of the economies around the world that have for too long been managing a lot of the waste that we have been sending to them. So it really just underscores the notion of getting a handle on reducing the unnecessary materials we are producing while ensuring proper management policies and solutions are in place to deal with the remaining fraction of the waste stream. So why does it matter though? You know, we talk a lot about plastics, and it's really easy to get captured into there's a lot of plastics going into the ocean every year, but why does it matter? And I'm going to do a quick check by a thumbs up. Does everyone see the screen now that says why does it matter on my PowerPoint? Yes, excellent, good. Just want to do that tech check. Well, it matters for several reasons. First and foremost, at the most basic level, images like this are simply unacceptable. This is a beach in Hong Kong that I've had the pleasure to work on several times over the years, where we just see an exorbitant quantity of plastic pollution accumulating based on its orientation within Hong Kong Bay. And unfortunately, this is not the exception. There are far too many places around the world that look like this just due to the amount of plastics that are leaking into the ocean and ultimately pile up on remote coastlines that are far too often out of sight, out of mind. And so aesthetically, this is not okay. But what does it actually mean in terms of the health of our ocean, health of our economies, and the health of us as people? Well, we know that more than 800 marine species are impacted by ocean plastics, and that ranges from the smallest organisms like phytoplankton, zooplankton, krill that whales and other cetaceans are fully dependent on, all the way up to charismatic megafauna like many of the great whales themselves that are feeding indiscriminately through filter feeding in the case of baleen whales. So we know that the entire marine food chain is exposed to the threat of marine plastics. We also know that there's an array of products that are most damaging to marine organisms. So we see here some research my colleagues and I published several years ago shows that when you evaluate the threat of marine debris across marine taxa, so to seabirds, sea turtles, and marine mammals, we see these 5 product categories being the most deadly. Fishing gear hopefully should not be surprising. It's designed to kill. When it becomes lost in the marine environment, it does so indiscriminately for very long periods of time. But then the remaining products you see there are largely consumer disposable goods that do pose a very real risk in the marine environment. So we know that plastics, big and small, pose a risk to the marine organisms. And so let's start with the large stuff, fishing gear. Again, we know that fishing gear is made to deliver utility and to serve a very specific purpose in capturing fish and other marine harvestable organisms, and it does so very, very well. But when massive nets, whether it's trawl nets, seine nets, long lines, etc., are lost to the marine environment, they do pose a very real threat for very long periods of time. And this is the deadliest form of marine debris. And so at Ocean Conservancy, we've been pleased to lead the Global Ghost Gear Initiative for the last several years, which brings together partners around the world throughout the global seafood supply chain other nonprofit organizations, and now 17 countries to look at best practices that can be put into place to prevent gear loss in the first place. And again, we know these horrific scenes of whales and other cetaceans becoming entangled in gear is simply unacceptable. At the same time, we also know that lost gear in the ocean poses a very real threat to the health of our ocean and economies that depend on it. We know that by weight, upwards of 3/4 of debris floating at the sea surface is lost fishing gear. We know, depending on geography, somewhere between 5 and 30% of harvestable fish stocks are killed by ghost gear every year. This is lost gear. And then lastly, as we look at an increase in population pushing 8 billion people globally, we know that nearly 1/3 of that population relies on a healthy seafood supply for their primary protein. So when we look at the issue of ghost gear and lost fishing gear, this is one that really is a lose-lose-lose situation if we do not get a handle on it. Individuals lose because their protein sources is decreased. Fishers lose because their economics and profits are decreased, and governments that are trying to provide support and healthy ecosystems are reduced because of the damage that gear poses to marine ecosystems within their country. So again, really an issue that we are working to get a handle on, and we're very pleased to see kind of the global galvanization around this issue over the last several years. That's the big stuff. If we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, small stuff matters. This is an image that I took on a beach in Hawaii, on the southern tip of the Big Island, Hawaii, known as Camilo Point, nicknamed Junk Beach. And what you see here is basically a patch of beach or sand that should be pristine and white, but instead we see it confettied with various forms of small microplastics. And microplastics are those plastics that are less than 5 millimeters in width, so roughly the size of your pinky nail or smaller. And they can be created through a variety of mechanisms. And on this particular beach, just to give you perspective, in 1 square meter, this image you see here, we found more than 84,000 pieces of plastic. Why does this matter? Well, we know that microplastics are actually the most abundant form of debris found at the sea surface globally, with estimated 51 trillion particles globally. And actually just a few weeks ago, a new study was published showing that there may be as many as 14 quadrillion pieces of microplastics at the seafloor. To be honest, quadrillion is a number that doesn't really register in my head. It means there's a lot of zeros there. But basically what we know is that while the big stuff is what we see, the small stuff really, really matters. And we know this because when we think about exposure to marine life, pretty much everything can be affected by very, very, very small pieces of plastics. And when we think about microplastics, there's various ways that they are created. There are some that are actually made to be small. So the very small pellets that are the building blocks of all plastic manufacturing, known as nurdles, can just spill into the ocean. Microbeads, which historically were put into different forms of cosmetics and paint abrasives, glitter, and then there's secondary. And these are the ones that we think about. You have your plastic bottle. It might accidentally find its way into the ocean. Once it's in the ocean, because of wind and wave, action, it slowly fragments into smaller and smaller pieces. And instead of that one bottle, you now have hundreds of very small pieces of plastics. And then lastly, an increasingly concerning area of research is microfibers. And these are the things that shed from our clothing, shed from ropes, shed from carpet, but basically synthetic materials that are abrasive and begin to shed and find their way into waterways in the ocean through wastewater systems. And so all of this is to say the small stuff really does matter. And the reason it matters is because increasingly we are seeing evidence of microplastics throughout our global seafood value chain. And if we look at what we know, it is that estimated that 60% of fish globally are contaminated with microplastics. This means they are found with plastics either in their gut or in their muscles and tissues. So this is not saying fish are not safe to eat. This is simply saying that we are seeing more and more the evidence of plastics in fish globally. What we also know, and this is the more concerning element, is that colleagues of ours, Dr. Chelsea Rockman at University of Toronto, sampled fish from both fish markets in Indonesia, as well as in California in Half Moon Bay. And in their sample is more than 25% of all the fish they were buying for human consumption also tested positive for microplastics. So the very fish that we are eating is being found with plastics both in its gut as well as in its tissue. And then the final piece here is we know that particularly species that are consumed whole, so shellfish, bivalves, oysters, clams, mussels, these are perhaps the species of greatest concern because there is no distinction between the tissue and gut. Everything is consumed, and so all the plastics in those organisms then are transferred into the human system. And our colleague at Ocean Conservancy, my senior researcher, Dr. Berta Bejler, she has looked at the exposure of humans to this via shellfish consumption. And what you see here is there is a wide variability. In the Pacific Northwest, we see upwards of 6,000 particles being consumed annually. In other parts of the world, like China, where shellfish make up a very large portion of their diet, we see extraordinary amounts of exposure on a human basis via seafood consumption. So all this is to say is we really do need to evaluate the potential harm that we are doing to our seafood supply, given it is such a critical source of protein for us globally. The last thing I'll say is that we also know that we are finding microplastics now in the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's trapped in sea ice. We are seeing the release of this during the summer months when Arctic sea ice is melting. And so it truly has permeated all of our marine ecosystems. And then lastly, and I know all of you care very much about the ocean, but even if you don't care about the ocean, we are seeing the effects of microplastics in pretty much all dimensions of our human life. So bottled water, tap water have all been documented to have microplastics. Table salt has been found with plastics. And then, my silly takeaway to everyone is even if you don't care about any of that, even beer has been found with plastics in it. And so, we are talking about truly a global crisis here when the brew has been affected. So again, the takeaway here is really just that we are talking about not just an ecosystem of global contamination, but more or less all planetary dimensions, including humans, are now being contaminated with microplastics or plastics more broadly of greater size. And then lastly, there is a real economic impact to this. So research has shown that economic losses because of ocean plastics are upwards of $33,000 per metric ton. And so what we're talking about is roughly $500 billion of losses to our global economy because of plastics in our ocean or our beaches. So across all aspects, whether you care about the ocean, whether you care about healthy animals, whether you care about healthy seafood supply, whether you are concerned about a healthy maritime economy, plastics is a threat to all of those things. I should say plastic pollution is a threat to all of those things. And so we need to get a handle on it. So where are we now? Things have really changed in the last few months as well, and I'll wrap very shortly, but we also know is that COVID is changing our relationship with plastics as well. And what we know is that monthly, globally, we are now using almost 200 billion items of personal protective equipment, almost all of which is made of plastic that is non-recyclable. And we expect this growth to continue over the next 5 years just because of concerns around human safety. And that's absolutely right. Human health should be first and foremost concern, and PPE is an important component to delivering that protection. But we also know that PPE is ending up in the ocean. We've seen anecdotal evidence in the very early stages of the global pandemic around COVID. Images like this were being published in media outlets around the world. And then over the last several months, through our data collection efforts at Ocean Conservancy, through our International Coastal Cleanup, which is a global beach and waterway cleanup effort, we are starting to see real data as well. And just in 1 month's worth of data, very preliminary, we have seen already that 70,000 items of PPE have been documented on beaches and waterways in more than 90 countries around the world. And again, these are very preliminary data. We expect this number to grow significantly based on our historical data records. But all of this to say is that we know that the introduction of PPE into a regular behavioral component of our daily lives is likely to exacerbate our global plastic pollution and ocean plastic challenge that we are all confronting daily. But it's also important to acknowledge that across the spectrum of plastics, PPE is one of these more necessary forms of use. And certainly, yes, you can use reusable face masks if your community says it is safe to do so. But we do know that there's a variety and an uptick in disposable plastics and single-use plastics as a result of our increasing dependence on delivery and takeaway services during the pandemic. And this is really a symptom that is symbolic of a long 3-decade transition of where we are seeing disposability and consumption patterns in our country. So again, I referenced our international coastal cleanup data. Every year, Ocean Conservancy publishes its annual Ocean Trash Index, which highlights the most common items found on beaches around the world. And this highlights last year's data where nearly 5 million food wrappers were found on beaches and waterways in a single day. And this was before the pandemic. And so again, what we see is that we know there are a subset of products out there like disposable food containers, like plastic bags, like straws in most instances that we can do without, while we need to more responsibly address the necessity forms of plastics like PPE and other durable goods that really do provide a critical utility and safety to our daily lives. So what we're seeing in this pandemic is a microcosm of a growing trend over the last 3 decades of disposable plastics really infiltrating all aspects of our daily lives. So lastly, what can all of we do? Again, I'm happy to, I really look forward to our question and answer this evening, because a lot of what I've talked about is the issue and the problem around plastics. At the same time, there's an amazing amount of effort and innovation going on globally to actually tackle this issue and start bending the curve of plastic pollution. And one thing that we all can do is go out in our backyard, our front yard, our local beach, taking safety, social distancing measures, and do our part, you know, just to pick up the debris that we are finding on beaches and waterways, wearing gloves, and again, ensuring safety against any exposure. And we've been doing this again for 35 years through our International Coastal Cleanup. And our CleanSwell app that you see there on the left side of your screen is a way that you can document your impact and your efforts anywhere, anytime. So our mobile data app, CleanSwell, any information you collect on what you're finding on your local beaches, your local waterways, after you submit that, immediately enters into our global database, which is the largest global database in the world on marine debris. And we use that information routinely to inform policies at all levels of government, local all the way to national and international. So that's just one small step that we can all do, is, you know, do our part when we're seeing debris, making sure we're wearing gloves and protecting ourselves against it, but just to eliminate the threat of that debris finding its way into storm drains and ultimately out into the ocean. And again, I'm happy to speak more broadly on the amazing efforts going on around the world to get a handle on this issue. But I have already spoken far too long and appreciate the great patience and audience you've all been. And we'll simply say thank you. And in conclusion, you know, I would summarize my talk tonight by, we know we've seen tremendous ambition, but current efforts to reduce plastic waste to date do not suffice alone. We need all solutions. We need them bigger, better, faster, starting now. And lastly, we do simply need a fundamental rethink of our relationship with plastics in the global society, and really identify those applications are necessary versus those that are really unnecessary and are exacerbating our problem that we've seen for many decades now. So lastly, thank you so much. Look forward to your questions, available anytime via email. You can follow me on Twitter where I talk a lot about this issue. And again, just thank you very much for being such a great audience and for inviting me this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And I would, we're a small group, and so I would just recommend people unmute themselves and ask questions if anybody has any. I have some, but I'm going to allow people to go ahead of me. Or if you're embarrassed, if you're shy, you can put them in the chat room and I'll ask them.
I do have a question. We can start. That's okay. So Nick, you were talking about the economic losses caused by the pollution. Can you elaborate that? It's, you know, when I'm talking to people, I'm not sure I can explain that very well. And it's very impactful if we can actually make them see the point.
Yeah, absolutely. And those numbers are without question an underestimate. It's just where you can actually get definitive data. But really what factors in there is lost harvest due to known fishery losses. When you look at the taxpayer dollars that are being diverted in local communities to clean up beaches and pay for, you know, removal efforts that otherwise would be directed towards more social beneficial goods versus just cleaning up litter. And then also just terms of those are the hard costs. There's other estimates that are higher when you start to factor into ecosystem valuation, but those numbers are very squishy and it's very hard to determine this. So those numbers I share are actual economists applying real dollars lost to economies through lost harvest, through impacts to maritime navigation because of gear and other forms of debris fouling up propellers that require increased transit time, fuel consumption, et cetera. So those are the real dollars. We know those estimates are likely much higher, but it's just really difficult to actually put tangible numbers on that. But that alone, $500 billion a year is not an insignificant amount of damage to global economies.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question.
All right, Diane.
As we know in California, at least, stores went from giving away plastic bags and people started using recyclable bags, and I'm sure most all this group does. But now the stores charge for thicker plastic bags. Anything we can do about that?
I'm sorry, you said stores are now charging for single-use bags, is that right?
Yeah, they're thicker than the old ones. But they
and so that was one of the provisions that was introduced in the statewide bag ban that I actually will say was probably the reason it passed in its first instance. So by making that bag thicker, it is deemed now reusable because it is a thicker, more durable plastic bag. It is a challenging piece. I will say data do show that when you charge for a bag, in addition to the outright ban, the act of actually charging and asking people the question of, are you willing to pay for this bag? That effort alone significantly reduces bag use. So yes, in a perfect world, you would have no availability of any form of kind of plastic disposable bags at all. But I will say allowing that reusable single-use bag, so to speak, to still be available with a charge is a best worst case option. But obviously the outright ban and the leadership that California put into place was really groundbreaking. And I think we're going to see over the coming months and coming years that state and potentially even the federal level in the US, more aggressive single-use legislation. We just saw New Jersey pass the most aggressive legislation in the country that phases out plastic bags, foam food containers, straws, even six-pack rings. And so I think thanks to California, in many ways, we have gotten over that initial hump, and we are starting to see many other states follow the lead.
Okay.
Thank you for your question, Diane.
Other questions? I have one in the chat room, but anybody want to go live? All right, so Kim says there is a boat where they collect plastic large amounts in another country. I don't know if you've seen it on the web. Can that happen in the United States?
Yeah, so if we're referring here to the ocean cleanup, which was based out of the Netherlands, has gone out to the North Pacific Gyre, you know, I will say I think I speak for the broader scientific community when at present cleaning up the ocean, going out to the middle of the ocean is really not our best use of resources and funds because the analog we always use is, you know, if your bathtub is overflowing, you don't first start getting a bucket and scooping it out, you turn off the faucet. And we need to get a handle on the upstream production side of things. With that said, cleanup is a critical component, both on beaches. Ocean Conservancy has been supporting that for years, but also where we see great opportunity is in waterways. So there's a lot of innovative technologies out there. The Baltimore trash wheel is a great example where you can use the natural flow of water, use renewable energy sources to capture debris where it's most consolidated before it has the chance to enter into coastal ecosystems, where we know it quickly disperses and where we know the majority of marine life lives. So coastal ecosystems are far more abundant with species of all sorts, whether it's cetaceans, whether it's turtles, whether it's fishes, versus the open oceans like the North Pacific Gyre, which are largely devoid of large amounts of marine life. So cleanup critical, but I think we want to start close to shore in river mouths before we go out to the open ocean.
Nice.
Nick,
Thank
along
you,
that
Jim.
same line, I'll go. Al, were you going to ask a question?
Sure. I thank you, Nick. Your presentation was awesome. Scary, but awesome.
Oh, thank you.
I gotta apologize. I mean, everything was kind of okay until you threatened the beer, and then things went. But the reality is, I have a friend of mine, Cynthia Matsky. She's involved with looking at that North Pacific Gyre. Help me out on that.
Gyre, yep.
Gyre.
Yep.
She's been doing research there for years, and she got me aware of that a number of years ago, and I was amazed. She said it's like the size of Texas. Now, the fact that it's so many teeny particles that, you know, you could look at it and it's almost like clear water, but it's got a lot of stuff in it. And people getting to know about that is critical. So what you're doing is fundamentally awesome. So I guess that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much, because I mean, just listening, I'm like, wow, I knew there's stuff going on out there, and I'd love to see it keep changing. And I really particularly like your analysis or your comment, stop the spigot. Don't worry about the water sloshing on the floor. Get it stopped at the beginning. So thank you, and keep it going, dude. Keep it going.
Thank you, Al. And I just want to reiterate the point of I could give an entire hour presentation about all of the amazing things that are going on to get a handle and reduce the issue. We are in an amazing time of innovation, but I do think it's really important to set the scene and just give a sense of the magnitude of the problem. But it's not all gloom and doom. There is a lot of amazing solution-oriented work going on as well. So thank you, Al. Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Nick.
That was actually, Nick was going to be one of my questions, and that was what are you aware of as far as the universities and departments of material science? We got to get upstream on this stuff. And if I had a company, I'd be reluctant to get rid of my cheap plastics unless you can replace that with something. So what are you aware? Maybe that's the hour-long talk you're talking about. So
I'll scratch the surface, but I think what we know is that it's not just about getting rid of plastics, it's using also the right plastics. And so when I talk about the unnecessary forms that we should eliminate, plastic bags, we know there are suitable reusable alternatives that provide the same type of good. Foam takeaway containers, so polystyrene, most people think of it as styrofoam. It really just cannot be recycled at an economical way. There's no value in most of its air. But we do know that there are, where it's available with composting, there's great composting alternatives. but even other forms of plastics that are more rigid as takeaway containers can at least be disposed of in your curbside recycling that can then be recycled. And so it's also thinking about the smart use of plastics that can be regenerative versus just one-day disposable. But then there are some great companies out there that are looking at fiber-based solutions. And there's many of them. One I know of because they're named Footprint. They're based out of Phoenix, Arizona. They are basically taking scrap cardboard and fiber from around the world and manufacturing it in ways that provide packaging solutions for many of the things that we traditionally think of for plastics. So six-pack rings, microwavable mac and cheese containers are now in, compostable fiber instead of plastics. And it's really just pushing the limits and not accepting the fact that this is how it is and trying to investigate through an engineering and technology perspective, like what is possible. And that really then all comes back to, it's about the design side, but also the management side, and ensuring that we are considering how do we increase composting? How do we ensure recycling is not 8% in this country, but we are increasing it to 60% because we're creating the markets and demand for recycled material. So it's a complex system, but all that is to say is there is good innovation happening. And it's not just about getting rid of plastics. It's about using the right types of plastics in the right applications.
And kind of along that same line, getting upstream, not only in terms of manufacturing, but is in terms of education. And I know all of our nonprofit organizations like Oceans Conservancy, we're stretched way beyond what we're capable of doing. But I saw in your presentation some wonderful elementary school and junior, senior high school curricular items. And one of the things that we did here in San Diego was to try to educate people about the plight of the little vaquita porpoise. And we try to aim that at the elementary schools, both in San Diego and Mexico. But you've got some great stuff. So do you guys have somebody, and I'm not applying for the job, but do you have somebody in education that is working on curriculum? Because it's really, really interesting. And then because of the current political climate, I won't go there. There may be a new opportunity, even at a federal level, presenting itself.
Yes, there's probably a whole other hour conversation there, but I do think the opportunity is moving into 2021 in terms of getting a stronger hold on this issue politically are encouraging. On the education level, yes, we are very fortunate to have some great folks I work with on my team that do a lot of education outreach. If you visit oceanconservancy.org, visit the Trash Free Seas page, you'll find a lot of these resources. Feel free to email me and I can connect you to the right folks. We have a lot of materials. What I shared tonight is not even the compelling stuff. A lot of really great elementary, middle, high school oriented stuff in multiple languages that is digestible for Spanish, Chinese, German, the whole gamut speakers. But education is really a part of what we do. And then even the mobile app I shared, CleanSwell, that is available in 6 or 7 different languages now, but definitely all of the primary languages that you would find in the San Diego, primarily in the San Diego community. So completely agree, education's critical. And it is, about just, I talked again a lot about the problem, but we often like to talk about empowering individuals to really be a part of the solution. And that's what a lot of our education's about. The problem is important, but our individual actions, many people, I'm just one person, it's just one straw. 8 billion of us on the planet, if everyone decides to skip that straw once or twice a day, all of a sudden that's a very real impact you're having on upstream drivers of plastics production and what's available for pollution. So we'll just echo your sentiments on how important education is.
And then we have another question in the chat room. Plastics are basically made from organic, parentheses, oil, compounds. Are any biologists working on evolving microorganisms that may eat the plastics?
So I am not a chemist. I'm not a molecular biologist. What I can say is most of the studies that have been published over the last decade or so, when they begin to show some signs of bacteria or organisms eating plastics, it's not the full story. It's not necessarily the bacteria itself that is doing the degradation. There's some other effect going on there. What I will say is that, I don't think we should rule out the ability for bacteria or other organisms in the ocean and the environment more broadly to find a way to deal with this alien material. The Earth has been around a lot longer than humans in our synthetic materials. But I do think, when we think about solutions, it gets really complex when we talk about trying to innovate or find a solution to deal with the back end of the problem. So once it becomes the waste, versus trying to design on the front end in a manner that is conducive with either composting or full circularity. So you design a product so that after I use it, it can easily be put back into the supply chain and made into a new product. And so really trying to shift our focus from how do we deal with it once it becomes waste to how do we design it in a manner where we try and eliminate the notion of waste altogether because it's such a valuable material. But Scott, thank you for that question again. I am no chemist or molecular biologist, so hopefully that suffices for your answer this evening.
But along those lines, then I'll get you, Jane.
Okay.
Along those lines, here in California, we pay, I think it's called a CRV on packaging material. Do you guys have any data on how effective that is? I mean, you still see bottles, thrown out that people have paid additional money to recycle and technically get that money back. You have any idea whether that's being effective, or maybe we should try to find another way to use that money?
It's not, again, there is no single solution, but what I can say is that in the United States, a paper that I published with some colleagues of mine a few years ago, and then actually just a recent study that was published by partners of ours in Virginia, just reinforces the fact that states that have CRVs, so I live in Portland, Oregon, and we have a CRV, there is a statistically significant difference in the amount of bottle and beverage container litter you see in CRV states versus non-CRV states. It's still not perfect. You have some that escape the system, but there is clearly, when you put in place that financial incentive to retrieve that product, you do not see it in the environment in the same type of way. It doesn't necessarily address the folks that go out to the beach with their 3 or 4 cases of beer or soda and have a late night party and end up leaving it there. But it does address like the upstream community city-based waste management, because there is a real value on that. And it's, so that is, when we think about solutions, the CRV is interesting. It is for a very specific product. And so you need to be careful that by implementing that, you don't, devalue the rest of the material that is in the waste stream. But we absolutely know that container deposit legislation has a very good positive effect on litter in the environment.
Thank you. Jane?
Yeah, my question is back to maybe what is the U.S. doing right now with their plastic that they're supposedly recycling? I mean, obviously we sent some off on a great big ship and it ended up in the water, but what are we actually doing now?
That's the land of opportunity.
Okay.
So the study I presented to you, that US study, that is based on 2016 data, the best available data that we have. At the end of 2017, China closed off its borders to all foreign imports of plastic waste. Very shortly after, many other countries in Southeast Asia closed their borders to plastic waste because for a variety of reasons, and understandably so. What we now know in 2020 here in the United States, exports of plastic waste have decreased 66%. At the same time, our waste generation is going up and our recycling rate has decreased almost a full %.
Wow.
And so what that means is we have a lot more plastic waste being generated. And this is conjecture, I do not have data on this, but my colleagues who are waste management experts theorize that that means we have a lot more plastic waste now going into US landfills or going into incinerators or waste to energy facilities in the US. I'm not sure if it's an upside, but what I would say is what we know is for too long, recycling companies in the US could not compete because the economics just did not work against overseas. So we have a decent amount of capacity here in the US to rejuvenate recycling. What we need is markets. And so when we think about policies and legislation, it's fine if we say, and companies are saying, we need to get, we pledge to have, 100% of our products to be recyclable by 2025. That's good. That doesn't actually create the market. What we need is to say by 2025, by 2030, 50% of all bottles have to contain, or 50% of all bottles have to have 50% recycled content in them. What that means is all of a sudden companies have to get recycled material. And overnight, you're creating the demand for recycled material and the systems will fix themselves. If there's a market for it, people will find a way to get the material. And so when we think about how we get a handle on this, it's really trying to think about how do you create the market forces to allow the systems to figure themselves out, because there is no one system fits all. Every community is different, every state's different, but if you create the end demand, the rest of it, to a certain extent, will figure itself out. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's all to say there is a huge opportunity for us here in the US, and that is to create the demand for the recycled material, but it's for the high valued recycled material like bottles, like rigid containers, while phasing out the plastic bags and films that honestly contaminate the waste stream, so that it's easier for companies and recyclers to get the best value out of that high value material.
Okay, thank you.
And let's go around one more time. Yeah, ask for other questions. Go ahead.
Oh, I had one. Al here.
Okay.
Nick, my question is, we're all very blessed. We are watching you on our computers, and we're listening to you. What is being done to help people who are not as lucky as us, people who are not able to see, not able to hear? I'm looking for, the question is there stuff being put together to help those less advantaged than us understand these issues?
It's a really great question, Al. And if you're speaking specifically about, the disabled community,
I was thinking blind and deaf people specifically.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. I think there's been a lot of amazing efforts, and rightfully so, to ensure social and environmental justice is being upheld and is more and more front and center in this conversation. But I'm not sure, in terms of dissemination of materials and information, I'm just speaking for myself and my knowledge, I'm not aware of as many great resources reaching those communities. I'm sure there are great groups out there doing it, but I personally, I'm not aware of that. So that is a great comment, and I appreciate that.
I'm looking forward to seeing something in that. I mean, I'm not affected that way, but I'm also looking at outreach. I mean, there's people out there that totally want to help this cause, but they may not know anything about it.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks.
I think we may be at the end of our questions, Jane, so I turn it back over to you as our president.
Okay.
Well, actually, Leanne is practicing to be our president.
That's right. Leanne, do you want to close tonight's meeting?
Throw her under the track.
I'm not sure. More than thank you, and it's been great listening to you, Nicholas, and discovering some of the stuff out there, and and to the rest of you, see you next month. Well, we'll post whether or not we have an official speaker and who it will be. But so just make sure you check our website. Anything else?
No, that's
I think
it.
that's good. Thanks, everybody.
Is that it? Okay.
Thanks,
you.
Nick.
Thank you,
Stay safe,
everyone.
Thank you
Thank you,
all.
Nick.
Take care.
And we
Bye-bye.
did record this, so it'll be on our website in probably a couple of days.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you
Good
all.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Nick. Keep it up.
Thank you.